In July 2016, in the direct aftermath of a historic political vote that weakened the pound, the British technology industry lost its crown jewel. In a matter of weeks, a Japanese conglomerate purchased Cambridge-based ARM Holdings for £24 billion. At the time of the sale, ARM did not manufacture a single physical chip, yet its architecture powered 99% of the world's smartphones. It was the undisputed standard for global mobile computing, dictating the hardware inside almost every pocket on the planet. The consequence of the acquisition was immediate. Britain's most successful technology export, an ecosystem built by a generation of Cambridge engineers, became a foreign-owned asset. The nation had fostered the brain of the mobile age, only to watch global capital swallow it whole. The paradox was absolute. The British architecture was more powerful than ever, but the country that invented it could no longer afford to keep it. But the real story of ARM is not only the story of a £24 billion sale, it is the story of how a small British computer company tried to build a machine for the classroom and accidentally designed the architecture of the modern world. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, software houses, and architectures that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when global forces took over. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in a quiet Cambridge design office in 1983. To understand how Britain built the brain of the global smartphone, you have to look away from modern glass data centers and return to Cambridge in 1983. At that exact moment, Acorn Computers was the undisputed king of the British educational technology market. The company had won the fiercely contested contract for the BBC Computer Literacy Project, placing the BBC Micro, a rugged, heavily built home computer, into nearly every school classroom and ICT room across the country. A generation of British pupils were learning to code in BASIC, pressing their fingers against mechanical keyboards, and watching typed lines become movement on classroom television screens. The BBC Micro was not just a product, it was a public service promise that Britain would not be left behind in the digital age. But behind the high street success in the government contracts, Acorn had a severe problem. The BBC Micro was powered by the MOS technology 6502, an 8-bit processor. A processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, decided how quickly a pupil could see their software react. The 6502 had been brilliant for the early 1980s, but it was aging rapidly. To keep their grip on British schools and capture the emerging business market, Acorn needed a new machine. It had to be significantly faster, capable of handling advanced graphics, windowed environments, and complex professional software. The engineering team in Cambridge looked out at the global market to find a processor for their next machine. They tested the available 16-bit and 32-bit chips from American giants like Intel, Motorola, and National Semiconductor. The results were a shock and the realization was grim. The American chips, such as the Motorola 68000 and the National Semiconductor 32016, were certainly faster, but they were massive, incredibly complex, and generated too much heat. The American semiconductor industry was built on a philosophy of complex instruction set computing, or CISC. This meant the chips were packed with thousands of built-in, highly specific commands. However, when the Acorn engineers monitored how software actually behaved, they found that these complex commands were rarely used. The chips were forcing the computer to do unnecessary work. This made the physical silicon expensive to manufacture and, crucially, slow to communicate with memory. Memory, the fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running, was the absolute bottleneck of the era. The American processors were so complex that they spent too much time simply waiting for instructions to arrive from the memory chips. In a British comprehensive school, or for a household saving up for a home computer, expensive and hot silicon was a fatal flaw. Acorn could not afford to build a machine around a processor that would require expensive cooling fans, massive power supplies, and high-priced memory chips. It would simply price them out of the educational market entirely. The breakthrough arrived not through a massive corporate investment, but through observation. Acorn engineers visited the Western Design Center in America, a tiny operation that was successfully updating the old 6502 chip. It was a revelation. If a handful of engineers in an unassuming office could design a microprocessor, then a small, brilliant team in Cambridge could do exactly the same. Acorn decided to gamble the entire future of the company on a radical, academic concept that was only just being discussed in American universities: RISC, or reduced instruction set computing. Instead of making the chip more complex, the Cambridge team would make it vastly simpler. By stripping away all the unused, heavy instructions, the processor could execute very simple commands incredibly fast, completing most of them within a single tick of the computer's internal clock. The project was named the Acorn RISC machine. It was not a grand, arrogant plan to conquer the global electronics market or defeat Intel. It was simply a desperate, highly focused attempt to build a better, cheaper, cooler brain for the next generation of British school computers. The architecture was designed by Sophie Wilson, who mapped out the instruction set, while Steve Ferber designed the microarchitecture. When the first test silicon, the RM1, arrived back in Cambridge in April 1985, the engineers plugged it into a test board. It worked immediately, but more shockingly, it was incredibly efficient. When they first ran it, a fault meant the chip was not even receiving power from the main supply. It was running solely on the tiny leakage of electricity from the other surrounding components. The ARM processor required so little power to function that it barely registered as being turned on. This extreme power efficiency was viewed as a mildly interesting accident. Acorn was building a desktop computer that plugged into a wall. It did not care about battery life. What they cared about was that the ARM chip was astonishingly fast. In 1987, Acorn released the machine that housed this new processor, the Acorn Archimedes. It was a staggering piece of British engineering, encased in angular plastic and running a proprietary operating system. The core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run. The Archimedes was arguably the fastest personal computer in the world at its launch. Running at 8 megahertz, it was capable of 4 million instructions per second. It could render 3D graphics and run complex simulations that made contemporary IBM machines look entirely obsolete. The Archimedes successfully entered British schools. Across the UK, pupils sat in computer labs moving a 3-button mouse, exploring an interface that felt years ahead of its time. But the market reality was shifting violently. The global computing industry was no longer competing on pure engineering brilliance. It was consolidating around the IBM PC standard and Microsoft software. Businesses, developers, and increasingly households were choosing compatibility over speed. The Archimedes required developers to write software specifically for Acorn's architecture. In the late 1980s, publishers were abandoning regional platforms to focus entirely on the massive, unified American PC market. Acorn had built a Formula One engine, but they had placed it inside a school computer that the rest of the world chose to ignore. The high street shelves began to shrink. The software houses moved their resources. The Archimedes was a brilliant British computer that lost the global desktop war. But inside its plastic case, the processor was waiting for a different kind of machine. By 1990, the British home computing boom was effectively over. The high street shelves that once displayed rows of rubber-keyed machines and local educational computers were rapidly clearing space for beige, IBM-compatible PCs. The traditional British tech model, building a physical machine in a local factory, placing it in a cardboard box, and shipping it to Dixon's or Comet, was breaking under the weight of global scale. Acorn Computers was caught in a shrinking fortress. The Archimedes was still a marvel of British engineering, but it was increasingly confined to school ICT rooms, dedicated computer labs where local education authorities dictated the hardware. The global desktop market had chosen Microsoft software and Intel hardware. But inside the Acorn offices in Cambridge, a different future was quietly arriving, carrying an American passport. Apple Computer was secretly working on a revolutionary device called the Newton. The Newton was designed to be a PDA, a personal digital assistant, a handheld device used for contacts, notes, and simple computing, meant to be carried in a pocket rather than left on a desk. Apple had a profound engineering problem. To make a handheld device useful, it had to run on standard AA batteries for days or weeks. When they tested the available processors from the dominant American chip makers, the results were disastrous. The chips were so complex and power-hungry that they drained batteries in hours and generated enough heat to make a plastic, handheld device uncomfortable to hold. Apple needed a processor that was fast, small, and ran almost cold. They scoured the globe and found exactly one architecture that met their impossible criteria. It was the Acorn RISC machine, the extreme power efficiency that the Cambridge engineers had discovered by accident in 1985, when the ARM1 processor ran purely on leaked electricity, was suddenly the most valuable technical trait on the planet. However, a massive corporate roadblock stood in the way. Apple was a global giant, but it could not build its next flagship product entirely dependent on a processor owned by Acorn, a direct competitor in the desktop computer market. If Apple was going to use the chip had to be permanently separated from the computer company. In November 1990, a remarkable corporate divorce took place. Acorn, Apple, and an American chip manufacturer named VLSI Technology agreed to spin the processor division out into an entirely new, independent company. They called it Advanced RISC Machines Limited. The reality of this new British tech company was completely at odds with its future scale. 12 Acorn engineers packed up their desks, left the main Acorn building, and relocated to a converted barn in Swaffham, Bulbeck, a quiet village just outside Cambridge. Apple invested £1.5 million in cash. VLSI provided the software tools to design the silicon. Acorn provided the intellectual talent. The new company, led by a charismatic chief executive named Robin Saxby, faced a terrifying truth. They had a brilliant processor architecture, but they were a tiny team in a barn with virtually no money. Traditional American semiconductor companies like Intel and Motorola spent hundreds of millions of dollars building massive fabrication plants, highly controlled factories used to print the physical silicon chips. ARM could not afford to build a factory. They could barely afford their office supplies. This poverty forced ARM into a decision that would alter the history of global technology. Because they could not afford to manufacture chips, they decided they would not manufacture anything at all. Instead, ARM pioneered a business model based entirely on IP licensing. Intellectual property licensing, the practice of selling the blueprints and the rights to use a design rather than selling a physical object. ARM would design the architecture, write the instructions, and map out the microscopic logic gates. They would then send a digital file to other companies, allowing those companies to manufacture the chips themselves. In return, ARM would receive an upfront licensing fee and a small royalty for every single chip produced. This model completely changed the meaning of Cambridge computing. It was no longer about soldering motherboards or assembling plastic cases for the British high street. It was about pure, invisible thought. Saxby gathered his 12 engineers in the barn and set a mandate that sounded absurd for a company of their size. He declared that the ARM architecture had to become the global standard for embedded computing. An embedded system, a computer built into a larger device to perform a dedicated function, rather than a general-purpose desktop machine. To achieve this, they could not remain a secretive British project. They had to act like a global utility. By licensing the design, ARM solved another critical problem for mobile electronics. The architecture allowed hardware manufacturers to create a SoC, a system on a chip. A system on a chip is a design that combines the processor, memory controllers, graphics, and other essential components onto one single piece of silicon. This integration saved immense amounts of physical space and battery power, making it the perfect foundation for the coming wave of portable gadgets. The first major test of this new ecosystem was the Apple Newton itself, which launched in 1993. The Newton, famously, was a commercial failure. Its handwriting recognition was flawed, and the device was mocked in the press. But while the plastic casing and the Apple software failed to capture the public, the ARM 610 processor inside it performed flawlessly. The chip ran exactly as promised, fast, cool, and incredibly efficient. The death of the Newton was the ultimate proof of ARM's new system. If ARM had been a traditional hardware company that built the Newton, the failure of the device would have bankrupted them. But because ARM only licensed the brain inside it, they simply collected their royalties and moved on to the next customer. They began aggressively licensing the architecture to anyone who wanted to build mobile electronics. The strategy was simple. Make the ARM architecture so cheap, so accessible, and so ubiquitous that it became completely pointless for any other company to design their own mobile processor from scratch. The British engineers in the Cambridge barn had successfully separated the brain from the body. They no longer cared what the final plastic gadget looked like, what brand was printed on the box, or which high street shop sold it. They only cared that their architecture was beating inside it. ARM had stopped trying to build the physical computer. It was now ready to build the ecosystem that would power everyone else's. By the late 1990s, ARM had transitioned from a desperate spin-off in a converted Cambridge barn into an invisible global titan. The licensing model had unlocked a form of industrial scale that traditional hardware manufacturers could never touch. Instead of managing factories, inventory, and logistics, ARM sold ideas. They sold digital blueprints, precise geometric layouts of logic gates that could be embedded into any piece of silicon on Earth. The first major proof of this scale arrived through the telecommunications boom. In 1998, Nokia released the Nokia 6110, a mobile phone that became an international phenomenon. Millions of users carried the device in their pockets, using it for calls, simple text messaging, and the iconic game of Snake. Inside that plastic case beat an ARM processor. The extreme power efficiency that had been a happy accident in 1985 was now the single most critical asset in consumer electronics. A battery-powered device could not survive with an energy-guzzling American processor. It required ARM. As the mobile phone market exploded across the British high street, from Dixon's windows to high street phone shops, the architecture quietly consumed every rival manufacturer. Texas Instruments, Samsung, ST Microelectronics, and Qualcomm all licensed the design. They took the Cambridge blueprint, added their own specialized circuits, and manufactured billions of physical chips. Every time a mobile phone was sold anywhere on the planet, a fraction of a penny flowed back to a modest office in Cambridge. This was the triumph of network effects, the pattern where a product becomes more valuable as more people use it. Because every major electronics company adopted ARM, software developers naturally wrote their applications for the ARM architecture. Because the software was there, hardware makers had to use ARM to run it. The loop was absolute, unbreakable, and terrifyingly efficient. By the mid-2000s, Cambridge had become the silent capital of the global digital age. The city of university colleges, medieval spires, and bicycle lanes was now hosting the intellectual engine of the entire mobile hardware market. Engineers in Cambridge were designing the future of computing, while massive foundries in Taiwan and South Korea stamped out silicon by the trillion. Yet the true peak of this empire was still ahead. In January 2007, Apple revealed the iPhone. The iPhone was not merely a phone, it was a pocket computer that combined a touchscreen, a display that also responds to finger or stylus input, an operating system, an app store, and constant internet connectivity. It was designed to replace multiple categories of devices at once: the pocket organizer, the digital camera, the MP3 player, and the mobile browser. At the heart of the original iPhone was an ARM-based chip, custom designed by Samsung, but built entirely upon the architecture licensed from Cambridge. When the smartphone revolution swept across Britain, transforming living rooms, commutes, and school playgrounds, every single device relied on the intellectual property forged in a Cambridgeshire village. ARM was no longer just powering mobile phones, it was powering the primary interface through which modern humanity interacted with technology. By the early 2010s, to walk down a British high street was to witness a physical manifestation of ARM's absolute victory. In the illuminated display windows of Carphone Warehouse O2 and EE shops, every flagship smartphone, regardless of its operating system or the brand printed on its glass back, was fundamentally an ARM machine. Whether a British consumer was buying an Apple iPhone, a Samsung Galaxy, or an HTC handset, they were purchasing Cambridge intellectual property. The sheer volume of the licensing model defied traditional manufacturing logic. By 2013, the number of ARM-based chips shipped globally surpassed 50 billion. They were no longer just in mobile phones. The architecture had expanded into digital cameras, set-top boxes, devices that connected to televisions to decode digital broadcasts, broadband routers, and the anti-lock braking systems of modern cars. ARM had effectively monopolized the concept of low-power computing. The true genius of ARM's position was its enforced neutrality. The global technology market was tearing itself apart in fierce legal and commercial battles. Apple sued Samsung, Samsung countersued Apple, Google's Android fought for market share against Microsoft's Windows Phone. Yet behind the vicious courtroom dramas and the high street marketing wars, all of these sworn enemies were quietly sending royalty checks back to a British technology park. ARM was the Switzerland of the semiconductor industry. No one could afford to build a mobile device without them. And because ARM licensed its architecture to everyone equally, no single company could monopolize the supply of the chips. The ultimate proof of ARM's impregnable fortress was the complete humiliation of Intel. For decades, Intel had been the terrifying giant of the processor industry, dominating the beige desktop PCs that filled British offices and homes. When the smartphone era arrived, Intel poured billions of dollars into trying to force its complex, power-hungry architecture into mobile phones. They offered massive subsidies to manufacturers to reject Cambridge, but the laws of physics and the laws of the ARM ecosystem could not be rewritten with pure cash. Intel's chips were too hot, too battery draining, and crucially, they lacked the developer support that ARM had quietly accumulated over 20 years. The American giant was forced into a humiliating retreat, abandoning the smartphone market entirely. The Cambridge upstart had defeated the biggest semiconductor company on Earth, not by out-manufacturing them, but by outthinking them. In a British high street phone shop, where glass screens replaced physical keyboards and broadband internet slipped into pockets, the right architecture did not merely run software. It decided who commanded the mobile economy, who survived the smartphone transition, and who held the intellectual keys to the modern world. The ecosystem was entirely locked. An ecosystem, the network of hardware, software, users, developers, and publishers that make a platform valuable, becomes impenetrable when the cost of leaving it is higher than the cost of staying. For a global manufacturer to abandon ARM, they would have to rewrite millions of lines of software, redesign their entire operating system, and alienate thousands of app developers who had built their products exclusively for the ARM instruction set. The trap was sprung. The world was utterly dependent on a company that employed only a few thousand people in the UK. By 2015, ARM's revenue was staggering, and its profit margins were those of a pure software company. They reported shipments of nearly 15 billion chips in a single year. That equated to roughly 40 million ARM-based processors entering the world every single day. 460 chips every second. It was an industrial empire of invisible logic gates. The company that had started in a converted barn to build a better processor for British school computers had achieved a level of dominance that neither Sinclair, nor Amstrad, nor ICL could have ever imagined. They had not just won a market segment, they had become the foundational infrastructure of 21st century human communication. Cambridge had become the silent capital of the global smartphone age. But that extraordinary scale and the massive financial valuation it created was exactly what would make the company impossible for Britain to keep. The first crack in ARM's British empire did not appear in the Silicon. It did not happen in a Cambridge laboratory, and it was not caused by a rival chip manufacturer building a better processor. The first crack appeared in the structural reality of the London stock market. By 2015, ARM had achieved total global scale. Their architecture was the unquestioned standard. But this monumental success had triggered the trap of global capital. ARM was a company that designed the future, yet it was listed on the Financial Times Stock Exchange, the FTSE 100, a British index dominated by historic banks, fossil fuel conglomerates, and supermarket chains. In the eyes of the City of London, ARM was a solitary anomaly. British institutional investors and pension funds treated ARM like a reliable dividend machine. They appreciated the steady flow of royalty checks coming from global smartphone sales, but they did not value the company with the immense aggressive premiums seen in Silicon Valley. ARM was a foundational monopoly, but because it was anchored in the UK financial system, it was effectively trading at a regional discount. The market forces at play were corporate consolidation and global scale. ARM had grown so large, and its architecture was so utterly essential to the global economy, that it had outgrown the financial ecosystem that nurtured it. At the same time, a subtle shift was happening on the British high street and across the world. The smartphone market was reaching saturation. By early 2016, almost everyone who wanted an ARM-powered smartphone already had one. Apple reported its first ever drop in iPhone sales. The upgrade supercycle was slowing down. To maintain its dominance, ARM knew it had to expand its architecture into new, vast territories: cloud data centers, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. A network of everyday physical objects embedded with sensors and processing power. But moving into these massive new sectors required years of aggressive, high-risk financial investment. It required sacrificing short-term profits for long-term survival. The British financial establishment, heavily reliant on quarterly returns, had little appetite for this kind of expensive gamble. This hesitation created a dangerous window. ARM's share price wobbled. The company was momentarily vulnerable, heavily reliant on a maturing mobile phone market, and arguably undervalued by its own country. It was the perfect target for a global predator armed with vast reserves of patient capital. Then came the external shock that broke the fortress open. On the 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. In the immediate aftermath of the referendum, the financial markets reacted violently. The value of the pound sterling plummeted against the US dollar and the Japanese yen, dropping to levels not seen in decades. Almost overnight, every single British asset became significantly cheaper for foreign buyers. For Masayoshi Son, the billionaire founder of the Japanese technology conglomerate SoftBank, the drop in the pound was the signal he had been waiting for. SoftBank had been quietly watching ARM for 10 years. They understood what the British stock market had failed to fully grasp. ARM was not just a successful company, it was the toll bridge for the entire digital future. Whoever owned ARM owned the fundamental grammar of modern computing. With the pound severely weakened, SoftBank calculated that they could buy the entirety of Britain's greatest technology success story for £24 billion. To a normal observer, it was an astronomical sum. To a global mega fund, it was the bargain of the century for absolute control over the mobile world. The approach was made in absolute secrecy. In July 2016, less than a month after the Brexit vote, Masayoshi Son flew to a coastal town in Turkey to meet with ARM's chairman. There was no drawn-out corporate battle. There was no rival British consortium stepping in to protect the asset. The sheer weight of the capital offered, a 43% premium on ARM's closing share price, made it a fiduciary impossibility for the British Board of Directors to say no. The transaction moved with terrifying speed. In a matter of weeks, the company that had started in a Cambridge barn, the company that had built the architecture for the Archimedes, the company that had silently conquered the global high street, agreed to be entirely absorbed by a Japanese holding company. The architecture was mathematically flawless and commercially untouchable. The sovereignty of the company, however, was about to be erased. The reaction from the British government in the summer of 2016 was remarkably compliant. The recently appointed Prime Minister, Theresa May, actively praised the £24 billion takeover. It was framed politically as a triumph, a demonstration that post-referendum Britain was entirely open for global business. But within the British technology sector, and among the engineers who remembered the converted barn in Swaffham Bulbeck, the acquisition felt like an unconditional surrender. SoftBank did not buy ARM to destroy it. In fact, they made legally binding promises to double the UK workforce over 5 years and keep the headquarters firmly in Cambridge. They poured billions into research and development, allowing ARM to aggressively target data centers, massive buildings filled with servers, networking equipment, and cooling systems that run modern cloud services. But the fundamental nature of the company had changed. ARM was no longer a sovereign British entity charting its own course. It was a single chess piece on the board of SoftBank's $100 billion vision fund. The intellectual property was still drawn up in Cambridge, but the ultimate authority, the financial leverage, and the strategic destiny of the architecture now belonged to Tokyo. The danger of this foreign ownership became terrifyingly clear 4 years later. In September 2020, SoftBank, facing severe financial pressure from its other global investments, announced it was selling ARM. The buyer was not a neutral holding company. It was Nvidia, the American semiconductor giant, who offered $40 billion for the British firm. This proposed sale struck at the very heart of ARM's survival mechanism. The Cambridge architecture had conquered the world because of its strict neutrality. It was the Switzerland of the semiconductor industry, licensing its blueprints equally to bitter rivals like Apple, Qualcomm, and Samsung. Nvidia, however, was a direct competitor to those companies. If an American chipmaker owned the foundational blueprint of the entire mobile world, they could restrict access, raise licensing fees, or prioritize their own hardware. The global ecosystem panicked. The companies that had built their empires on Cambridge Silicon immediately lobbied regulatory bodies across the world to block the deal. In Britain, the narrative finally shifted. The government, which had waved through the SoftBank sale in 2016 with polite applause, suddenly realized the magnitude of what they had lost. They launched a formal investigation on national security grounds, acknowledging far too late that the microprocessor architecture controlling global communications, defense systems, and energy grids was perhaps a critical national asset. Under immense regulatory pressure from the UK, the European Union, and the United States Federal Trade Commission, the Nvidia deal collapsed in early 2022. ARM was safe from being absorbed by an American rival, but it remained firmly in the hands of SoftBank. Because the private sale failed, SoftBank enacted their backup plan. They decided to return ARM to the public markets through an IPO, an initial public offering, the financial process of selling shares of a private company to public investors on a stock exchange. This decision triggered the final, humiliating chapter for the British financial establishment. The British government, including a succession of prime ministers, launched an intense, desperate lobbying campaign to convince SoftBank to list ARM on the London Stock Exchange. They argued that ARM was a British company, a Cambridge institution, and the pride of UK technology. They pleaded for a dual listing, a compromise that would at least keep a portion of the company trading in its home country. But the structural reality of the global market was absolute. The London Stock Exchange simply could not offer the immense financial valuations provided by the American markets. Investors in New York understood massive technology premiums. Investors in London still demanded traditional, safe dividends. In September 2023, ARM went public on the NASDAQ exchange in New York. The London Stock Exchange was entirely bypassed. The most successful technology company Britain had ever created, the very company that proved the UK could dictate the foundational standards of the modern digital age, explicitly rejected its own country's financial system. It was the ultimate proof of the market forces that had eroded British tech for decades. Britain could design the future, but it could not provide the capital required to hold on to it. The engineers stayed in Cambridge. The royalty checks kept flowing. The valuation was priced in dollars. The shares were traded in New York. The board answered to global capital. The logo remained. The sovereignty was gone. Today, the ARM logo is still highly visible across modern business parks in Cambridge. Thousands of British engineers still walk into those offices, write code, and map out the microscopic logic gates that will define the next decade of artificial intelligence, automotive computing, and cloud infrastructure. The company is, by any metric of revenue or global influence, more powerful than it has ever been. But as a sovereign British technology empire, the story's over. ARM operates as a subsidiary of a Japanese conglomerate, traded on an American stock exchange, valued in dollars, and subject to the geopolitical pressures of foreign capitals. The brand survived, but the ultimate authority over the architecture did not. Yet the legacy of what happened in that converted barn in Swaffham Bulbeck remains the most extraordinary achievement in British computing history. And it contains two profound, almost poetic surprise footnotes. The first is the ultimate vindication of the architecture itself. For 30 years, the prevailing narrative was that the Acorn Archimedes, the brilliant British machine that first introduced the ARM processor, had lost the desktop computer war to the Intel-powered IBM-compatible PC. Intel owned the desk, ARM owned the pocket. But in 2020, Apple announced it was transitioning its entire line of desktop and laptop Mac computers away from Intel chips. They replaced them with Apple Silicon, custom processors built entirely on the ARM architecture. More than 3 decades after the Archimedes was pushed out of the British high street, the instruction set designed by Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber finally evicted Intel and conquered the global desktop market. The architecture won the long game. The second footnote brings the story back to where it started. In 2012, a group of Cambridge engineers, deeply concerned that British pupils were no longer learning the fundamental mechanics of coding, launched the Raspberry Pi. It was a tiny, bare-board computer designed to recreate the public service, educational magic of the original BBC Micro. And the processor chosen to power this new British classroom dream? An ARM chip. The architecture had come full circle, returning to the very educational environments that first demanded its invention in 1983. This is why the story of our ARM passes the ultimate test. It is not simply nostalgia. When you visit the Center for Computing History in Cambridge or walk through the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, you will see the physical relics of this incredible journey. You will see heavy beige BBC Micros sitting on recreated school desks. You will see an Acorn Archimedes, its angular plastic casing yellowing under fluorescent lights. You will see early Apple Newtons and thick mobile phones with worn rubber buttons. These objects are not merely retro curiosities. They are a physical argument about a time when computing was a public service ambition, a classroom project, and a local high street industry. They prove that the foundational grammar of modern life did not magically appear out of Silicon Valley. It was forged out of sheer necessity because a British company needed a cheaper, cooler chip to put into a school computer. The British preservation community understands this deeply. Across the UK, in collector forums and vintage computer clubs, enthusiasts still carefully repair Archimedes motherboards. Archivists painstakingly image old floppy disks, removable magnetic storage formats used to save and load files, to ensure the early RISC operating systems are not lost to bit rot. They rescue old Acorn machines from charity shops, car boot sales, and e-waste bins. They preserve the exact physical moment when British hardware was arguably the most advanced on the planet. The philosophical summary of the ARM Empire is a harsh lesson in the reality of global technology. Britain has never lacked the intellectual capacity to invent the future. From the Colossus codebreakers to the Manchester Baby, and from the Sinclair ZX Spectrum to the ARM processor, the country has consistently produced brilliant, world-changing paradigms. But a technology empire requires more than a clever invention. It requires a financial and industrial ecosystem capable of protecting that invention when it reaches global scale. Britain lost ARM because its financial markets could not comprehend the valuation of a company that sold invisible blueprints, and because its political system fundamentally believed that free market foreign acquisition was always preferable to sovereign protection. The brilliant engineers of Cambridge successfully separated the brain from the body. They proved that an ecosystem of intellectual property licensing could conquer the massive physical manufacturing might of America and Asia. They built the silent engine of the 21st century, but in doing so, they built a machine entirely too valuable for their own country to keep. Somewhere in a Cambridge museum, an original Acorn Archimedes sits quietly behind a glass case, its old silicon dormant, while the visitor standing in front of it stares at an ARM-powered smartphone in their hand, entirely unaware that the brain inside their pocket and the relic behind the glass share exactly the same British soul. See you in the next one.